The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Pacific Sinoli Academy, where the scent of discipline mixed with the quiet intensity of warriors preparing for battle. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents come disguised as harmless strangers. Sometimes legends walk among us wearing the mask of ordinary life, their true power hidden beneath layers of time and circumstance. And sometimes, the greatest mistake you can make is assuming that age has weakened what was once unstoppable. In this prestigious martial arts academy, with its traditional values and respectful atmosphere, this is how our story begins with Elena Vasquez, a 65-year-old woman who carried secrets that could shake the very foundations of the fighting world. But first, she would have to endure something that would awaken a fire that had been dormant for 2 decades. She would have to face the kind of dismissal that transforms patience into fury, respect into retribution. What happened next would send shockwaves through the underground fighting community and remind everyone why some names should never be forgotten. The legend was about to return, and the martial arts world wasn't ready. Elena Vasquez, 65 years old, lived a life that seemed ordinary in every possible way. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore loose-fitting clothes that concealed a frame still lean and powerful despite the passage of time. To the outside world, she was just another retiree living quietly in a small apartment, working part-time at a local bookstore, moving through her days with the careful precision of someone who had learned to blend into the background. But Elena's apartment told a different story to those who knew how to look. Hidden behind books and furniture were framed newspaper clippings yellowed with age, tournament programs from events that no longer existed, and photographs of a younger woman standing victorious over fallen opponents, her hand raised in triumph, while crowds roared in appreciation. 22 years ago, Elena Vasquez had been known by a different name in the underground fighting circuit, La Sombra, the Shadow. She had been the most feared female fighter in the brutal world of no-rules combat, a place where technique mattered more than size, where intelligence could overcome brute strength, and where legends were forged in blood and sweat on concrete floors in abandoned warehouses. For 8 years, La Sombra had been undefeated. She had created techniques that later became standard in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies around the world, though few knew their true origin. Her ground game was poetry written in pain, her submissions so innovative that opponents would tap out to positions they didn't even recognize. She had fought men twice her size and left them unconscious on the mat, had faced multiple opponents simultaneously and emerged victorious, had earned a reputation that made promoters pay her more than any other fighter just to ensure she would show up. But Elena's dominance had come at a cost that went far beyond physical. The underground fighting world was controlled by dangerous people who didn't appreciate complications. When she had refused to throw a fight for a massive payout, when she had continued winning when she was supposed to lose, when she had become too independent and too powerful for their comfort, they had made their displeasure clear. The night that changed everything was burned into Elena's memory like a brand. She had won her fight as always, but afterwards her manager and closest friend Carlos had been found beaten to death in the parking lot. The message was clear: comply or face consequences that extended far beyond the fighting cage. The next morning, Elena Vasquez had disappeared from the fighting world completely, leaving behind only whispered rumors and gradually fading legends. For 22 years she had lived in hiding, constantly moving, constantly watching over her shoulder, letting the world believe that La Sombra had simply vanished. She had worked menial jobs, lived in small towns, avoided anything that might draw attention to her true identity. But she had never stopped training. Every morning at 4 a.m. in whatever space she could find, Elena practiced the techniques that had made her legendary, maintaining the edge that had once made her untouchable. Now at 65, Elena found herself in a position she had never expected. The men who had forced her into hiding were dead or imprisoned, their criminal organizations dissolved by federal investigations. The underground fighting world had evolved, become more legitimate, more regulated. For the first time in over 2 decades, Elena Vasquez was truly free. But freedom came with its own challenges. She had spent so long being invisible that she had almost forgotten who she used to be. The fire that had once driven her to greatness had been banked to mere embers, carefully controlled to avoid attention. She had become so accustomed to being underestimated, dismissed, overlooked, that she had started to believe it herself. Then she had seen the advertisement for Pacific Sino-Lee Academy, with its emphasis on traditional values and respectful training. Something stirred in Elena's chest, not quite hope, not quite hunger, but something that had been sleeping for far too long. She told herself she just wanted to see how the sport had evolved, to train with people who understood dedication and discipline. She didn't anticipate that walking back into a dojo would awaken everything she had spent 2 decades trying to forget. It was on a humid Thursday afternoon that Elena's carefully constructed new life began to crack at the edges. The Pacific Sino-Lee Academy sat in its modern facility, the pristine white walls decorated with the distinctive black and red logo featuring crossed swords and traditional martial arts symbols. Elena parked her old sedan among the newer vehicles, noting how the building's professional appearance spoke of serious training and significant investment. The afternoon air carried the energy of a place where authentic martial arts were practiced with proper respect and discipline. She pushed through the glass doors and was immediately transported back 25 years. The clean scent of well-maintained mats, the sound of controlled breathing during technique practice, the focused intensity that came from people pushing their physical and mental limits. It all felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. Master Kim approached the reception area with the measured steps of someone who had earned his authority through decades of dedicated practice. His black belt bore golden characters that spoke of high rank achieved through traditional progression, and his presence commanded the respect of every student in the academy. Behind him, a line of students in crisp white uniforms stood in respectful formation, their various belt levels creating a visual hierarchy that spoke to the academy's commitment to proper structure. Elena felt Master Kim's assessing gaze as he took in her civilian clothes, her age, her obvious unfamiliarity with the formal protocols of a traditional academy. His expression was professionally courteous, but clearly concerned about what she might be attempting to undertake. "Ma'am," Master Kim said with polite formality, "welcome to Pacific Sino-Lee Academy. I'm Master Kim. How may we help you today?" Elena kept her voice steady, though her pulse had quickened the moment she stepped onto the mats. "I'd like to inquire about training opportunities. I know I might seem like an unusual candidate, but I'm very serious about learning proper technique." Master Kim glanced toward his students, several of whom were struggling to suppress smiles at the sight of an elderly woman discussing martial arts training. "Mrs. Elena Vasquez." "Mrs. Vasquez, I appreciate your interest, but our training can be quite demanding. Perhaps you might be more comfortable with our meditation classes, or we have a gentle movement program for seniors that might better suit your needs." From behind Master Kim, 3 of his most accomplished students exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of the situation. These were David Park, James Liu, and Kevin Chang, all black belts who had earned their rank through years of serious dedication, all young men in their physical prime who understood the demands of real martial arts training. David, a second-degree black belt with 8 years of experience, stepped forward with respectful confidence. "Master Kim, perhaps Mrs. Vasquez would benefit from observing one of our advanced classes first. It might help her understand the level of commitment required." James, whose tournament record had earned him considerable respect in the local martial arts community, nodded thoughtfully. "We could demonstrate some of our standard techniques, nothing too intensive, just enough to give her a realistic picture of what training involves." Kevin, the most skilled of the 3 with a 3rd-degree black belt and an impressive competition background, maintained his respectful demeanor while clearly harboring serious doubts. "Master Kim, with all due respect to Mrs. Vasquez, our regular training involves significant physical contact. Even our most basic drills require a level of conditioning that might be challenging for someone of her age." Elena felt the familiar sensation of being dismissed, of having her capabilities judged by her appearance rather than her substance. But this time, instead of the patient acceptance she had cultivated over 2 decades of hiding, something else stirred in her chest, something that felt dangerously like the hunger that had once made her unstoppable. "Gentlemen," Elena said, her voice carrying a subtle shift that made Master Kim's eyes narrow with sudden attention, "I understand your concerns, but what if I told you that I'm not quite as fragile as I might appear?" The 3 young men exchanged glances that mixed polite skepticism with genuine concern for her well-being. They weren't being malicious, They honestly believed they were protecting her from something that could result in serious injury. "Mrs. Vasquez," David said with careful diplomacy, "martial arts training involves falls, joint locks, choke holds. Even with the most careful instruction, there's always risk of injury." Elena smiled, and for just a moment something flickered in her eyes that made Master Kim take an involuntary step backward. "What if I told you," she said quietly, "that I'm not here to start learning martial arts?" The academy fell silent, except for the sound of air conditioning and distant traffic. "What if I told you that I'm here to remember them?" The change in Elena's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of true fighters. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight distributing differently across her feet, her breathing pattern altering to the controlled rhythm of someone preparing for combat. The uncertainty that had characterized her movements since entering the academy evaporated, replaced by something that made Master Kim's trained eye recognize the presence of serious expertise. "You want to know who I am?" Elena asked, her voice taking on a quality that commanded attention rather than requesting it. 25 years ago, in the underground fighting circuits of Los Angeles, Mexico City, and Sao Paulo, I was known by a different name. She began to stretch with movements that were anything but random, each motion designed to activate specific muscle groups that hadn't been properly warmed for combat in years. The seemingly casual stretches were actually the preparation routine of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of physical readiness. They called me La Sombra, the Shadow. Some of you might have heard whispers about the underground scene, about fighters who competed in warehouses and parking lots for money that could change lives. I was the woman who walked into those places and walked out undefeated for 8 straight years. Master Kim's eyes widened with sudden recognition, his hand moving involuntarily to his mouth as pieces of martial arts history clicked into place. "La Sombra," he whispered, "the woman who created the Vasquez sweep, the submission specialist who fought men twice her size." Elena nodded, her movements becoming more fluid and purposeful with each passing second. "I developed techniques that are now taught in academies around the world, though most people don't know their origin. The ground transitions you practice, the submission chains your advanced students learn, many of them came from fights where losing meant more than just disappointment." The 3 black belts, David, James, and Kevin, stood frozen as they processed what they were hearing. They had studied submissions that bore Elena's innovations, had drilled techniques that had been born in the brutal crucible of no-rules fighting, had built their games on foundations laid by someone they had dismissed as a harmless elderly woman. "I disappeared from fighting 22 years ago," Elena continued, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that had cost her everything she had once been. "Circumstances beyond my control forced me to walk away from the only life I had ever known. I've spent 2 decades in hiding, moving from place to place, working jobs that paid bills but meant nothing, pretending to be someone I never was." She looked directly at each of the 3 young men in turn, her gaze carrying an intensity that made them understand they were no longer dealing with someone who needed their protection. "But the people who forced me into exile are gone now, dead or imprisoned, and for the first time in over 20 years I'm free to be who I really am." Elena walked to the center of the mat with fluid grace, then settled into a fighting stance that was textbook perfect, but somehow different from anything taught in modern academies. More fluid, more adaptive, shaped by real combat against opponents who hadn't been concerned with rules or safety. "I came here today thinking I wanted to ease back into training gradually, respectfully, like a beginner learning from masters. But you know what? I think I'd rather remind myself, and all of you, exactly who Elena Vasquez used to be." She gestured toward the 3 black belts with casual confidence. "The 3 of you together. I assume that seems fair. 3 young, strong, technically proficient men against 1 elderly woman who's been out of practice for 2 decades. The challenge hung in the air like smoke, and Elena realized she had just crossed back over a line she had spent 22 years avoiding. For the first time in decades, La Sombra was about to fight again. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed in martial arts communities around the world for years to come. Elena moved like a force of nature that had been contained too long and finally released. Every technique she employed was a masterpiece of leverage and timing. Every transition flowed with the kind of fluidity that could only come from someone who had once lived and breathed combat at the highest level. David attacked first, his 8 years of training making him confident despite his growing uncertainty about what they were facing. He shot for a traditional double-leg takedown, the same technique that had served him well in countless sparring sessions and tournaments. Eleanor didn't resist his takedown. Instead, she used his momentum against him, allowing him to drive forward while she secured an overhook and rolled backward, using his own energy to throw him past her, and immediately transitioning to his back as he tried to recover his balance. The rear naked choke she applied was a thing of beauty, not the basic version taught in most academies, but a variation she had perfected in underground fights where opponents were stronger, more desperate, and willing to do anything to escape. David had perhaps 3 seconds to recognize what was happening before the blood supply to his brain was cut off so efficiently that he was unconscious before he could tap out. 9 seconds total. James, drawing on his tournament experience and superior conditioning, tried to learn from David's mistake by maintaining distance and using his reach advantage. He threw calculated strikes designed to keep Elena at bay while looking for openings to implement his ground game safely. Helena slipped his punches with head movement that seemed to predict where his hands would be before he threw them, closed distance with footwork that appeared to bend space, and caught his extended arm in a standing kimura that she immediately transitioned into a takedown. James found himself on his back with Elena, controlling his arm in a position he had never encountered in any academy or tournament. The shoulder lock she applied incorporated elements of catch wrestling and judo that had been adapted through years of real combat experience. He tapped frantically, but Elena held the submission just long enough to ensure he understood the difference between sport jiu-jitsu and what she had learned in places where referees didn't exist to protect fighters from permanent damage. 18 seconds total. Kevin, now clearly understanding that he was facing something beyond his comprehension, tried to use his superior technique and third-degree black belt knowledge to match Elena's expertise. He attempted to implement the sophisticated guard game and submission chains that had made him the Academy's most respected advanced student. Elena welcomed his technical approach like an old friend. She flowed through his guard like water finding cracks in stone, anticipated his submission attempts before he fully committed to them, and countered his most advanced techniques with variations that existed nowhere in any instructional video or tournament footage. When she finally caught him in what appeared to be a standard triangle choke, Kevin initially wasn't concerned. He knew several escapes from that position and had used them successfully in competition. But Elena's triangle wasn't standard. It incorporated adjustments and details that had been forged in fights where losing meant serious consequences, where opponents were willing to break bones rather than submit, where survival depended on making techniques work against people who had never heard of sporting rules or fair play. Kevin tapped out to a submission that felt completely different from anything he had experienced in years of training, his consciousness fading just enough to let him know that Elena had allowed him to submit, rather than forcing him to unconsciousness. 27 seconds total. The entire sequence had lasted less than 55 seconds. Elena stood in the center of the mat, barely breathing hard, looking exactly like what she was, a master martial artist who had just remembered why she had once been considered unstoppable. The silence in Pacific Sinoli Academy was profound and reverent. Elena helped each of her 3 opponents to their feet, with the same care and respect she had shown throughout the brief encounter, checking to ensure that David had fully recovered from the choke, that James's shoulder was uninjured, that Kevin understood he had been submitted by technique rather than strength. Her demeanor had returned to the gentle manner of the woman who had first walked through the doors, but everyone present now understood that gentleness and lethality were not mutually exclusive traits. Master Kim approached her with the slow, deliberate steps of someone processing a fundamental shift in reality. When he bowed, it was with the deep formal respect reserved for masters whose expertise transcended normal categories of skill and knowledge. "Sensei Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying genuine awe, "it would be an honor if you would consider teaching at our academy. Our students, myself included, could learn more from you than from years of conventional training." Elena looked around the academy, taking in the faces of students who were seeing their understanding of martial arts completely rewritten in real time. David, James, and Kevin stood nearby, their expressions mixing embarrassment with genuine respect for what they had just experienced. "I appreciate the offer, Master Kim," Elena said softly, but I think I need to ease back into this world gradually. It's been a long time since I've been Elena Vasquez instead of just someone trying to blend in." She paused, looking at the three young men who had inadvertently helped her rediscover a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. "But perhaps I could offer some private lessons. There are techniques that aren't taught in books or videos, methods that were developed in places where martial arts were about survival rather than sport." David stepped forward, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility. "Sensei, I would be honored to learn from you. What we just experienced, I've never felt anything like it." James nodded enthusiastically. "The way you moved, the techniques you used, it was like watching martial arts from a completely different era, a more dangerous era." Kevin, still processing his submission to a position he had thought he understood, spoke quietly. "You didn't just beat us. You taught us that we don't know nearly as much as we thought we did." Elena smiled, and for the first time in 22 years, it was the smile of someone who no longer had to hide who she truly was. "Gentlemen," she said, "that might be the most important lesson you ever learn. The moment you think you know everything about fighting is the moment you become vulnerable to someone who knows more." She gathered her belongings and walked toward the door, but this time her movement carried the confident bearing of someone who had reclaimed their true identity. "Same time next week?" she asked Master Kim. "We'll be here," he replied, still amazed by what he had witnessed. As Elena left the academy, the students remained silent, each processing their encounter with a living legend who had chosen to reveal herself to them. 2 years later, Elena Vasquez stood in a warehouse in downtown Los Angeles, but this time, she wasn't there to fight. The underground scene had evolved since her disappearance, more organized, safer, but still carrying the raw intensity that had once defined her life. Now she served as a referee and advisor, the legendary La Sombra, who had returned not to reclaim her throne, but to ensure that other fighters wouldn't face the same threats that had forced her into 2 decades of exile. Young fighters approached her with the same reverence once reserved for mythical figures. She taught them not just techniques, but how to navigate the dangerous politics of underground fighting, how to protect themselves from the predators who saw talent as something to be exploited rather than nurtured. Elena had discovered something more satisfying than victory, the power to ensure that the next generation of warriors could pursue their passion without sacrificing their freedom or their lives. She became the protector she had once desperately needed, the mentor who could guide fighters through the treacherous waters that had nearly drowned her. Master Kim often visited her new role, watching in amazement as the woman who had once been forced to disappear now commanded respect from an entire underground community. In the end, Elena learned that true legends don't just survive hell. They return to build bridges, so others never have to walk through the flames alone. What bridges are you building for those who will follow your path?